Welcome to Elevating Education, new approaches to learning in a post-COVID era. Tonight, we're presenting a panel discussion where we will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on education and explore alternative approaches to learning in a post-COVID world. From the impact of mandates in schools to the rise of political ideologies within school curricula, many parents are now experiencing concerns about the state of education. Our guests tonight will share their unique perspectives on some of these challenges, but also the opportunities now facing parents and educators alike. We will explore the rise of homeschooling, alternative approaches to education, some creative ways to help our children learn, and explore what the future may hold for traditional education. This is a unique opportunity this evening to gain a fresh perspective on education and explore new approaches to learning. And we're delighted to be joined tonight by four unique guests. We're joined firstly by Dr. Val Fraser, who has a PhD in education and is a former teacher, teacher-educator, Ofsted advisor, and currently an educational consultant for a local authority. She's a member of the Heart Group, a co-founder of the Safer to Wait campaign, for children's health, and a mother of two adult children. We're also joined by Jo, who is a mum of two who took her children aged 9 and 13 out of school at the beginning of 2022. She spent the past 18 months learning more about home education and developing an approach that is tailored to suit her and her family and each individual child. We're also joined by David, who is a musician and a music teacher working in primary, secondary, and SEND schools in London. He's a long-standing interest in alternative and holistic education, particularly the philosophy of J. Krishnamurti and its practical application. Finally, Daisy is a qualified solicitor with a degree in philosophy. She's the founder of reimagine.org.uk and Super Sprogs, which is an ethical breastfeeding clothing company for children. Former school governor, member of Lawyers for Liberty, and mother to four-year-old twins. Daisy is here to share some new perspectives on where education can unfold. During the course of tonight's discussion, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions and engage with our panelists following our initial discussion. So Val, I'd like to kick off with you, if I may. Val, you've been involved in education for a large part of your career. What changes have you observed, and what do you think is driving the recent increase in parents choosing home education, particularly with some local authorities reporting as much as a 30% increase in parents home educating over the last 3 years during the COVID chapter?
Yes, there has been a big increase in parents wanting to take their children out of school. In some local authorities, we've seen a 30% increase. We've also seen a corresponding increase in children with significant diagnosable mental health issues. There's as many as 1 in 6 that fit into that category. So we're basically talking about 5 in every class who present with those significant mental health issues. We're not talking about just the odd day, we're talking about diagnosable conditions. And we've got 112 children who are ghost children, who they never appeared on registers after COVID, and they don't appear anywhere. So we have a real problem, really, ensuring the safeguarding of children. As many as 20% of children regularly did not attend school last year due to anxiety levels. So what appears to be driving the increase, and my own personal experience, it's probably two. There are those, we call it elective home education, but I do think also that it's driven by the mental health issues, as I said, children, and so parents are not really electing to home educate. They have a child who becomes so ill, so traumatized, so stressful, like any of us would be if we couldn't go to work. We'd have a doctor's note to sign us off sick. Children can't get that. There's all sorts of pressure to get them back into school, to get their register taken and so on. And so parents have little choice but to take them off register, off the roll of the school, in order to avoid the fines that come with enforcement. So yeah, there's that. It's home education by default. And then another group of parents that we're coming across are those who are saying they don't really like what's going on with schools anymore. There doesn't appear to be the pastoral concerns. Children don't seem to be very well looked after. They seem to need to fit into a mold, and they're also making those decisions about the political ideologies that are going on in school. They're saying, I don't want my child, to have the kind of curricular interventions which are going on for very young children. I've come across quite a few families who've taken their primary children out saying, well, sex education used to be taught in secondary school and it was appropriate then. So there's two groups of people, but I'd say the majority of teenagers coming out of secondary schools. I can go into the details of why I think it's not just pull factors with parents, but also push factors from school, if you like. That just involves a longer trajectory of going back into the past. But I don't want this to be a monologue. So I'll pause, I'll cede, and then we might come back.
Yeah, well, I just have another question for you, because I know many of our audience members tonight would have a shared concern of what happened during the course of COVID-19. And I know many parents, when there were things like mask mandates, when there was a vaccine rollout and people were concerned about informed consent and the possible risks associated with those products. So there's a group of people there who strongly reevaluated the role of education during that time in particular. And that's, I know, led to many people making the decision to homeschool, certainly during that time period. But also there were a group of parents who were afraid for their children based upon the public health messaging. And they similarly, for different reasons, were taking their children out of school. And it's shocking to hear the kind of statistics that are out there around how many children have not gone back to school or are not in formal education or some form of homeschooling. But do you think those policies during the course of COVID-19 has spurred a new wave of interest in homeschooling and alternative education?
Yes, and on the positive side, there are parents who did it at home and liked it and thought, actually, my child is learning more. And so they said, I'd like to carry on. They seem to be flourishing. They no longer seem to feel anxious to go to school. They like this. And then there are the other parents who understandably are picking up that schools became fearful places. Children were tested physically before they could enter the school building. It was like a test they had to pass before they could go in the door. Now, that has quite a profound impact on a sensitive child, being told, no, you've tested positive, you need to go home. Then the secondary children had to wear masks. Well, again, that's a message of fear. That's a message of fear. What I know from the research I've done is if a children doesn't have a voice in the learning process, then they never progress their learning beyond knowledge. They actually never get to understanding concepts. When you get to understand, there's the learning process, there's the knowledge that they take on board. But to understand it and to apply it in different contexts, you have to put it in your own words. Well, there was no group talk. There was no interaction from the pupils. And so a lot of them, didn't actually get a very high quality service or product from the schools when it came to learning. And then I guess a frightened child, if you've got fearful messages around, keep 2 meters apart, wear your masks, and teachers continually asking children to do that, then a frightened child the lessons a frightened child is learning is to be frightened. If you've got all the windows and doors open, a cold child only knows that it's cold. He or she won't know, won't be comfortable enough. You've got to create a learning environment that's conducive to learning, which is the ability to risk, to find your own voice, to feel comfortable, to get things wrong, and it not to be a huge issue. And so I'm not surprised we're seeing this rising anxiety and attached to going to school. That's the collateral damage, and that's what parents are picking up.
Yeah, and I think that anxiety is palpable within the parents and the children. Joe, I'd like to come to you now. You made the decision to take your children out of school and pursue home education. Would you share a little bit about what led you to make that choice?
Yep. Home education was never something we considered when they were little. When they were entering school, it was just not something we even gave any thought to. It wasn't something we were ever planning to do. And what I found was as my son's my older child, and he was in year 5 when all the lockdown started, and then as he was getting older, he was in year 6, so he was looking to move into secondary school. And I think that was one of the things that got me sort of thinking a little bit more critically about school in general, because the thought of him going to secondary school, I just couldn't muster any enthusiasm for it at all. I just wasn't excited about it. And it wasn't the school he was going to. The school that he was going to was perfectly nice. I'd heard good things about it from other parents. So it wasn't the school. It was just secondary education in general. I just felt a bit flat when I thought about it, really. And the long hours, the testing, not just COVID testing, the academic testing, the homework, this sort of general, I just had this feeling of kind of drudgery when I thought about it. And so that was sort of got the cogs turning a little bit. I think when we were homeschooling them because of lockdown, obviously that gave a lot of parents, all parents, a closer look at what their children were doing. And you even more so than the homework they would bring home, because there would be plenty of weekends prior to that where we would have been looking at their homework going, why are they doing this? What are they getting from this? This is a bit daft, and we'd just kind of do it as quickly as we could and not really think about it. Whereas obviously when it was every day, we were really starting to think, some of this is just so stupid. They're not getting anything from this, and the kids weren't enjoying it, and it's just a tick box exercise. And so that led us to look a little more critically at primary school education as well, and just what were they getting from it? What were they really learning from it? How much of it was just busy work? Lots of killing time. My younger daughter, neither child has ever been bullied or anything like that, but my younger daughter, she used to cry before school quite a lot. There were a lot of tummy aches in the mornings, and we'd just kind of jolly her along and take her to school, and the teachers would say, oh, she's fine after you go, and we'd go, okay, and and not really think about it. And then obviously you reflect on it now and go, possibly wasn't all as okay as it was. And again, it was nothing specific that was happening to her. She just didn't really want to leave us and go in, even though she had friends and everything. And so it was a combination of things. And then we made the decision we were going to move. So we were in Hertfordshire and we moved to Cheshire at the beginning of 2021. And obviously that brought up the issue of the children changing schools when we moved. And I said to my husband, well, maybe we won't send them to school when we move. And he was just rolling his eyes and just, what are you talking about? But then the more he thought about it, it really didn't take him very long to come around. And we put all elements of school under the spotlight. We reflected on it, and it was hard. It didn't stand up to scrutiny. An awful lot of the elements just didn't stand up to scrutiny, and it came down to, I think, particularly for my son going to secondary school, I just thought the next 5 years we could make them so much more interesting for him, so much more rewarding for him, so much more tailored to him. And it just felt like there was no comparison really once we really looked at it. And so he started secondary school because we had a few months where we weren't quite ready to move. We were due to move in the January. So he started secondary school in the September, and he ended up doing just 8 days because he was so desperately unhappy right from the off that we just sat him down and said, do you want to just come out now? And with my daughter, we said, when we move, do you want to go to school or don't you want to go to school? And she said, no, I don't want to go to school. And so we've just taken it from there, really. And so it was a big house move. We took them away from, obviously the house they'd grown up in. We took them away from friends that they had, but not look back. We've not regretted it at all. And it's been hard work, I won't lie. It's not all been rosy. But now we're sort of 15 months down the line into properly giving all our focus to home educating them, and yeah, I wouldn't change it. It's really good.
I would like to come later on to talk about some of the lessons that you've learned through your homeschooling. But before we come to that, I'm curious a bit more about how you came to that decision together. It sounds like there was obviously different perspectives from yourself and your partner and the children obviously being involved. Did it feel like a shared decision? And can you tell me a little bit about the kind of feelings that came up for all parties during the course of making that decision?
Yeah. For me, I mean, it was my idea. I was the one who sort of brought it up, and like I said, my husband was a bit resistant at first because he was just a bit like, well, he told me afterwards, you know, his first response was, "Oh my God, why do you just have to be different from everyone all the time? Just be normal." But he, to his credit, he did give it thought and he reflected on it and he talked about it with people external to us. And I distinctly remember him, you know, he talked about it with friends. He'd been out for dinner with some friends of his one night and he came home and he went, "You know, I can't find anyone who says they enjoyed secondary school." It's just like nobody liked it. And it's true. I can't find any, you know, people have varying, you know, obviously different experiences, but there was no one who went, "Oh my God, it was brilliant. I loved it. I could do it again." So we did talk a lot about it because obviously it was big, you know, it is a big decision, and it's almost hard to remember now how much of a big decision it felt because it's just normal to us now. But we, like I say, we just looked at I was reading a lot of books because that's how I make sense of things. So I was reading books and listening to podcasts and really sort of filling my head with all these ideas and just feeding them all back to John. And yeah, it just ended up with both of us being quite behind it. And I was surprised we didn't get any pushback from our wider families. You know, people kind of got it. To my face, I've never had a negative comment about it. People are just curious and they want to know more, and they have misconceptions because they think home education is like the homeschooling we did in lockdown, which obviously it isn't. They think it's teaching your kids, which it's not me trying to be a teacher, it's me helping them learn. And I think that's an important distinction, you know. And with the children, my son was a little bit, when I brought up the idea to him, he was still in year 6. I sort of said, you know, we'll probably give you these options if you want them. And he was a bit apprehensive. And I think he sort of said, "Oh, I don't know if I want to be different." But like I say, when he started secondary school, he hated it so much from the off. And had we not been in a position to give him the choice of leaving, then maybe it would have been different. We would have tried to make the school side of things work somehow. But because we almost already had one foot out the door, it was just confirmation really that it was the right decision. And my daughter, she's just she doesn't look back, you know. She's just like, "Yeah, I'm leaving school. I'm gonna have a bigger bedroom. You're gonna get me a dog. It's all good." You know, so she was just completely unfazed by it, and like I say, she's happier. You know, we don't get the phantom tummy aches anymore. We don't get the tears. I guess she's just got a lot more control over what she's doing. You know, she goes to things that she's interested in going to, and she has a lot more say in the structure of her days and her weeks now.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'd like to come back later on and ask you about what you've learned from your experiences and how you found the experience later on. But before we do that, I'd like to bring David into the conversation, who it brings a different angle to this discussion. He's worked in primary and secondary education, but has a strong interest in alternative and holistic education. David, could you tell us a little bit about how your interest in holistic education and alternative forms of education have influenced your own teaching methods and your views on the education system, despite some of the negatives that we've touched upon in the education environment?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, because of the nature of what I do, I didn't get to see much of the most sort of pernicious sides of institutional education, because I'm in various different schools and my subject's music, and I'm generally allowed a fairly free rein in what I do. And the whole COVID thing was a massive shock to me. I mean, it was obviously a massive shock to everybody, but it was a massive shock to me in the sense of watching these mandates kind of just sweep into schools, and watching the way that there was no I mean, barely any resistance from teachers. In fact, teachers were some of the worst. I mean, you saw that the unions did, and they were pushing for longer, harder lockdowns and more mandates and all the rest of it. So whilst my interest in different ways of educating goes back quite a long way, this was the first time that I saw a real urgent need for this, a real urgent need for some sort of change and the possibility of an alternate way of doing things. I mean, that it sort of spurred me to get active as well in various different kind of ways throughout the COVID stuff. And one of my main issues with it was kind of coming back to what Val was talking about, the way that children, there was no effort to give children, they were terrified, as most people were at the time, and their parents were terrified as well, and they were obviously absorbing that from what they saw in the media and what they saw from their parents, what they saw in the papers, and whatever social media they were on. But there was no effort from the schools to try and reassure them, to try and kind of give them some kind of balance. And we knew, obviously, very early on that kids were statistically zero risk of this. We knew the risk profile of COVID. We knew that it was generally the very old and the very sick and all the rest of it that is sort of, I mean, even at the time, it was very well established. And what happened was you had the opposite thing happening. You had, like I said, generally I have sort of fairly free rein in regards to what I do, but we were sent resources by the borough, by the school, and there are other resources being produced as well, that were supposed to be informative resources. They were supposed to kind of help children understand COVID. And like we were saying, at the time, they were terrified and they were trying to make sense of it themselves. And there was no attempt to really genuinely help them do that. And what the resources seemed to be doing was priming them for the vaccine. It wasn't an attempt to kind of look at the risks and the benefits. It wasn't an attempt to kind of look at how at risk they were from COVID, looking at the fact, for example, that they were more at risk from flu than they were from COVID. And again, that was very clear from the beginning. And what you had was this very sort of on message stuff that they were being given, and they were and it was going straight from kind of a little sort of history of viruses and stuff, straight from that to vaccines. There was this direct thing, and obviously there was loads of different kind of ways that you could go from a little explanation about viruses, but there was this clear sort of trajectory that was happening, and it was really shocking for me at the time. I mean, seeing how many teachers just weren't questioning this at all. People who were supposed to be kind of, I mean, educators, they were supposed to be kind of helping children make sense of this and all the rest of it, weren't questioning in the slightest. And like I said, actually quite the opposite. And then seeing that these resources weren't doing what they were claiming to do. They were continuing the narrative, reinforcing the narrative. And like Val was talking about, we know at this point the devastating damage that it's had on kids, devastating psychological damage that it's had on kids. And I feel much of that could have been mitigated if they were given balanced information at the beginning of this. And if there was an adult in the room saying, guys, it's generally okay. It's not the Black Death that the media is painting this out to be, and particularly for you lot. Whereas what we got was all of this kind of nudging and manipulation and all the rest of it, and that was in the resources. And actually, I know that you've interviewed David Sharalambos, and he actually went through one of the sets of resources, pointing out where all the nudging and where all the NLP was happening and all the rest of it. So it was kind of seeing that stuff being pushed on children, and for me at the time, knowing that most of this stuff was completely irrelevant to them, and this wasn't about informing. Again, this was about, as far as I was concerned, priming, and laying out this clear exit route for them. And there was obviously nothing about natural health, and there was nothing about the effect that vitamin D would have had, and all these other things that we, even at the time, we knew about, but now we couldn't discuss them at the time, obviously, but now we're able to have, I mean, we're starting to have kind of slightly more adult conversations about the whole thing. So that was my position in regards to the COVID thing. And like I said, that there was, I've been interested in alternative education, holistic education for a long time, in regards to sort of Krishnamurti's schools and his philosophy and all the rest of it. But it never sort of seemed as urgent as it was until that point, really. And like I said, I didn't see the worst aspects of institutional education until this happened, and I realized how susceptible these institutions are, and how susceptible we all were, I have to say. And I think that's also a lot to do with our education. And I wonder how this would have played out if we did have it, if we all, like, societally had a different kind of education. And I would suspect it would have played out very differently if we had the sort of education that kind of Daisy's talking about and that Val's talking about. It would have played out very differently, and whether that's intentional or whether that's just because it's a more efficient way of doing things, I don't know. We could go down all sorts of rabbit holes in that regard.
Well, yeah, thanks, David. It's really interesting to hear how, you already had an interest in these other forms of education, but this unique event in history has become a catalyst. So what steps have you now taken in light of that kind of resurgence and interest in alternative forms of education?
I mean, I haven't, I'm still doing what I was always doing. So I'm still teaching in the same places, and I've been doing this for about 20 years. And I were in those schools that I was teaching in throughout COVID and prior to COVID as well. And my teaching's always been informed by by that philosophy and this idea that that there is a difference, but like Joe was saying, that there's a difference between learning and education. And there's this, and I think that the fundamental difference is possibly a kind of an authoritative thing rather than a well, our system's set up so you have an authority. You've got an authority, which is in this case the teacher, and the teacher is the fount of all knowledge, and the teacher's kind of just sort of giving this information to the students. But I think sort of holistic learning is a very different thing, in the sense that fundamentally there's a different relationship between the student and the teacher, in that you don't have that. I mean, although there's knowledge maybe that the teacher has, there's not that kind of authoritative dynamic there. And there's there's the possibility for the teacher to learn alongside the student, and there's the possibility for the teacher to be wrong as well. So there's not this kind of outsourcing everything to this personable authority and kind of just absorbing all of this stuff and being spoon-fed all this stuff they're saying. It's more of a a sort of cooperative process, and that and more than a sort of an explicit sort of way of changing a syllabus. It's more about, I think, a relationship, a sort of a shift in the relationship between the student and the teacher.
That's fascinating, David. And I think it harks into what Joe and Val were speaking about. But I'm curious now how this impacts on your work, Daisy. You know, your twins are now approaching traditional school age, but you've got ambitious plans for something different for your children's education. I'm curious to know a little bit more about those plans and perhaps how some of the prior discussion points feeds into those plans as they've emerged and developed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like Joe, never had any intention to do anything other than the conventional with my kids. I was like, they'll go to school. I live next door to a good school, so you can imagine how happy my husband is about me saying maybe we should not send them there. But yeah, I think I sort of, particularly over COVID time, started looking at how possibly the environment in school wasn't as much centered around well-being as Val mentioned, that kind of pastoral role, and did a lot of research on read a lot of critical books. There's an author, Alfie Cohen, who I particularly like, who really attacks lots of things that are wrong with schools that I hadn't even really thought about, but I read his book. He's got a particular book called The Schools Our Children Deserve that I really recommend, that it sort of talks through the impact of things like routinely testing and examining children and how that impacts how they behave. And it really resonated with me, for that was exactly my experience, that if you tell children the goal is to get the highest mark as possible in an exam, then the smart child picks the easiest subject to do. And that's exactly what I did at uni. I started doing 2 subjects. I was like, I'll do sociology because I know it and I quite fancy philosophy. And in my first 2 weeks, I was like, philosophy is loads easier. That's the one to do. And it created this bare minimum approach to learning, which was the complete flip of who I was as a person in terms of my work. I was the most passionate McDonald's employee you will ever have met. I adored that. I've always been really driven and enthusiastic about work, but school just created this thing for me that learning was boring and I didn't want to have to do it, and I had just minimal thing and get through it. And I think part of in 2020, and particularly kind of from lockdown onwards, suddenly was revived with this passion for learning myself. And I was reading up on medical journals and learning to understand all sorts of medical terminology that was way beyond my reach before. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is what learning is about. I'm interested in it, and there's a context that's meaningful for me, and that is that feeds the desire to learn. And I think that's kind of been part of the path I've been on, as well as I'm like Joe. I read a lot of books to try and absorb different philosophies and think about how I might do things. But for me, there's also a Michael Moore documentary on schools and why schools in Finland are so good. And they don't do anything but play until 7 years old. So for me, I was like, okay, well, I've got 4-year-olds. They can just play for another 3 years and we'll be sweet. But they really have this kind of well-being at the absolute core. And some of the people on this call will know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's so fundamental that you can't engage in these higher level activities, critical thinking, if you're hungry or you're feeling uncomfortable in the clothes you're wearing or all that sort of stuff. And so I guess what I'm looking to create is something that draws on lots of different alternative, broadly progressive educational philosophies. So some Steiner, and particularly the kind of feeding into creativity and younger children using their hands, forest schooling, Montessori. I'm particularly interested in a philosophy called Reggio Emilia, which sprung out in Italy after the Second World War, that the community was saying we need to never let fascism happen again, which is kind of how I'm feeling at the moment as well. So it's about bringing community into an educational environment, and also something that's really dawned on me more recently is how impactful play can be for children. That a year ago, if you'd asked me the difference between kids playing in the street, a game of football, versus an organized Saturday match that we're going to football club, I wouldn't have known there was any difference. But having read about it, actually there are substantial differences. For like the kid who's turning up to football practice on a Saturday, they're on the pitch, the goal is to beat the other team at all costs within the rules, and well, maybe not always, but generally beat the other team, and that's it. They're they're following whatever the coach says, and that's what they're doing. If you've got a sort of hodgepodge group of kids of different ages who live on the same street and they're playing a game, there's all sorts of really complex interpersonal things that they need to learn to make that game work. It's like you don't tackle little Johnny hard because you might hurt him and he's small and that's not cool. And with the bigger kids, you can really go for it because they're better than you, so you've got to have a go, but also and you've got to work out the teams so it's roughly evenly matched, because nobody's gonna, like, if anybody's feeling like we're being absolutely thumped here, this is awful, they're not going to want to play. And if somebody leaves the game falls apart. There's so much to it, and none of that is taught by adults. It's like the profound impact of having a meaningful context for learning, whether it's social or practical. It's like the difference between saying to someone, okay, come and sit down, you're going to be in this room for an hour and a half, we're going to talk about trajectories, here's a workbook, here's a circle, here's some lines going off it, versus saying, here's a pool table, have a play with this. Like, you know, there's so much more that can be given to children to let them have autonomy over their own learning, particularly at a young age.
I experienced a lot of what you were just saying just this weekend. I was attending a friend's birthday, and this age I tend to be surrounded by other parents, and there's lots of children there, and exactly that happened. You know, the young kids were figuring out in the garden, they had a goal, you know, a goal and a ball, or multiple footballs actually, but they're figuring out how they're going to set up the teams. There was children of different ages. How are they going to incorporate the different children? How are the boys going to get the girls involved? You know, it was really fascinating to watch when there was my little 20-month-old running a pitch invasion, you know, when they're much bigger lads, you know, how they slowed the game down to make sure he didn't get hit. You know, none of that was institutionalized or organized. It was all self-organized and self-learned, even down to really creative things. You know, they seem to like to impersonate their favorite players. So, you know, at times if they would stumble upon the fact they both wanted to be the same player, and they had to negotiate who would go first and who would take the role second. You can't get any of those lessons. You know, I'm not to say that the Sunday League doesn't have value as well, but that kind of self-organizing, self-learning was just fascinating to watch as a parent. Thanks, Daisy. Val, I would like to come back to you, you know, drawing together much of what's been shared so far. Just curious from your experience over the years in education in various forms, what you see as a path ahead for education, particularly around some of these forms of education that we've discussed, from home education to the different forms of alternative education. Yeah, how can we create more opportunities for these forms of education in our communities?
I suppose the majority of parents do want their children to go to school. And Jo will know, because I've talked to her about her home educating, that her children don't just learn in solo. You know, they're involved in groups. So the idea of children learning together is this is what we want in education. So then, you know, the concept of them going to school means that they have that means to, as you just described, what happens, you know, on that Sunday when you were with your friends and families and so on. So the communal collaborative learning is a must for children. They argue much more with their peers. And when I say argue, I mean build argument. They won't let their peers get away with giving them a low-key answer. They'll just say that's not right. So a lot of group work is absolutely essential. So I guess I'm saying we've got to get state education right, because that's what most parents have to have. They haven't all got the means to have their own schools or their own systems, or even just home educate. And I happened to have a conversation recently with a government minister who introduced Ofsted. He didn't know I was an Ofsted inspector, but actually I did tell him that. And he was quite proud. You know, he said, well, I thought it was good. You know, I wanted to create some competition. You know, the idea that it would improve, you know, schools would start to try and improve and get to the top of the rankings in like a business model. I said, oh, so it was like a business model that you thought would be good. He said, yeah, I did. And I said, well, congratulations, you've just made children profit and loss on a school's ledger sheet. And that's why they don't want the children who have extra needs. That's why they don't want to spend time in the classroom helping children with emotional difficulties, because they've been given their own budgets. And what counts is how many A stars they get at the end and what the Ofsted inspection and the league tables say about schools. So as Daisy said, I want to go back to the really strong pastoral system that we had. I have been a teacher back in the day, and what I valued more than I've ever been able to supervise my trainee students in school settings, I haven't been able to observe them do half as much as I did, which was that shoulder to shoulder interaction that you have with children, where you just sit alongside them and you talk to them about their learning. Teachers have become performers. It's all performative education, and it's all about cramming stuff down. If we had more self-directed learning, if we understood that knowledge can't be compartmentalized into subject domains, that's just for the organization of schools. You know, and anyone's listening here who's got grandchildren or children, I would say if you've got the opportunity to show them how multifaceted knowledge is, you know, you can take a subject like rivers and they study that in geography, but there's the spirituality of rivers. There's the idea that it has religious meaning in various countries. There's the art of rivers. There's the fact that there's some wonderful art. There's the outdoor pursuits that you could have when you're exploring rivers. You could look at the chemical compounds of rivers. You could look at the historical significance of rivers. You know, it doesn't have to be this knowledge in subject divided. That's just for the convenience of running a school. So I guess I'm you know, blue sky. I would love to at least open up some of the curriculum. And I think the time that we can have with our children, we could do that. Because otherwise children are the ones that have got to join up all these dots, really. I would love to stop the hemorrhaging of children with special educational needs and mental health issues from school, because that's just wrong. You're just telling children they are a loss on the ledger sheet. I've actually got a parent whose 9-year-old child was told by the head teacher, your son is costing me a lot of money. I mean, she said it out loud. And so, you know, why should children feel that they are a loss on that ledger sheet? So we've got to find a way of making children have their needs met. And that, as I say, that shoulder to shoulder interaction, not just with the school counsellor, but for every teacher to be able to have the opportunity to loosen the curriculum so that we're not so target driven. And it's a bit like, you know, you say, well, they've got to do that because when they get to 16, they've got to take these exams. Well, yeah, okay, at some point we funnel it down so they can pass their exams. I completely understand that we want children to have post-16 viable options. But if we're going to start at 5 and say, you're going to have to do that when you're 16, so you better start now, that's like telling, I mean, Dan, you've got a small child. Obviously I've got grown-up children, so I can't quite remember I don't quite know what the equivalent is, but my children used to have those cozy coupe cars they'd sit in, the red and the yellow ones. I don't know if other people have, yes. And they'd sit in it and they'd pretend they were driving. Imagine if I said to my 2-year-old, keep to the left, because at 17, you're going to want to drive and then you've got to learn to do it. So you might as well learn now. Why are we always driving children to that end? If we opened up the curriculum, if we kept it cross-curricular as far as possible, you know, in-depth exploration, and then gradually formalized it so that they can pass whatever exam. I mean, I'd love an exam revolution. Assessment is an imperfect model in education. We've never got assessment right. We never, ever have been able to assess potential. We only ever assess performance. Well, that is half to do with what the teachers have done in terms of the curriculum with the kid. So yeah. So the whole assessment is tricky. But if we've got to stick with the exam system we've got, well then yes, let's funnel them towards that at the time it's right. But there's no reason why children, especially young ones, can't learn to develop the skills and strategies of strategy, collaboration, collegiality. I want them to develop, time. They only look at history. Why can't you take a topic and look at it in the past, investigate it in the present, and imagine what it might be like in the future? Why can't we even open up time? So it's not just always looking back, but it's about taking a particular topic so that we expand children's horizons. So they've got a sense of past, present, and future, and not just all the kings and so on in the past or whatever. Anyway, I can talk for England on this, and I don't want to, because I'm sure you might want to open it up, or you might want to have question and answers from the audience.
Yeah, I think what you've shared there, Val, is in danger of creating lateral thinkers within children. I don't think the system is geared for that. I think
No.
Well, you've also touched upon a couple of, I think, what I would say is two of the primary objections I've heard to homeschooling that I'd like to address to Jo. One is the parents' role in educating. And certainly during the course of COVID and the lockdowns, I had a lot of friends who were parents who were suddenly, full-time, used to working full-time. Suddenly they got the kids at home. Some of them had been furloughed, some of them hadn't. And, all of a sudden they were then set with the task of facilitating the learning of their children. So that was an imposition on many parents during that time. Now, some people are now making the conscious choice because of what's happened in education to home educate, but still facing the same challenges. They're working full time, they're trying to figure it out. So I think that's one element I'd like to direct to you, Jo. And the second is this piece around socialization and shared learning, the shared experience. And again, during the course of COVID, I saw homeschool clubs where many parents would work together to co-educate across family groups, ignoring the rules of gatherings, to ensure their children had optimal opportunity to learn. So, Jo, I'd like you to, if you can, talk about your experiences, both as a parent and your role. As you stated, you're not a teacher, you're a facilitator as a parent in home education. And then secondly, speak around that piece that Val raised around social learning as well, if you may.
Yeah, I mean, first, sort of a bit of a disclaimer from my point of view is that we're still relatively new to this, still very much finding our way, and still in the process of trial and error and rejigging what we do and how we do and trying things. And that was the rule I said to my kids before we moved and before we did all this. I said, you've got to try things, because we're all, between us, we're finding our way, and you can try stuff. But the beauty of it is, if something's not right for you, you don't have to do it anymore, which is obviously quite different from a kid who's at school who just has to kind of get their head down and get on with it. So that sort of rule of thumb has worked for us. And I mean, the way we have, where we have got to, and obviously can only speak for my family, for what suits my children, because obviously every family is different, every child is different, and every family I know is doing it differently, and that is one of the great things, is that you have that freedom to tailor it, but it's also quite daunting, and it also means you have to just remain open-minded, because everyone's going to do it differently, and you have to let other people do it their way, and you have to stop comparing yourself, and you have to put a lot of thought and effort into it. And for us, for the age of our children, I think if you've got older children, they can do a lot more autonomous working, so it's potentially easier for both parents to work full time if the children are a bit older. For my particular family, my husband works full time. He did before the kids left school, and he still does. But he works from home a lot more now. You know, that worked out in our favour in terms of COVID, because we both started working remotely, so that gave us a lot more flexibility. So he's at home 4 days a week, which he never would have been prior to lockdowns and everything. So he only goes into the office one day a week. So that's great for us as a family. We spend a lot of time together. And actually, my daughter said to me last night, I said to her, what's your favourite thing about home education? And she said, it's because I get to see my family. I don't just see you in the morning, and I don't just see you in the evening. I get to see you lots more. And that, obviously, she's 9. That's really important to her. But I was working part-time, and I still work part-time, but I have scaled back my hours. And I've just found for myself, the way we're doing our home education, it works better for us, for me to not actually work that much. And I'm actually in the process of changing jobs anyway, which will give me much more flexibility working around the children anyway. And obviously, home education, it can happen at any time. It doesn't have to be 9 till 3. You know, you can educate your children at the weekend if that works better for you as a family, and there's other stuff going on during the week. You know, there's so many things you have to sort of unlearn. It's like, it doesn't happen Monday to Friday, it doesn't happen 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, it doesn't, you know, so many different ways you can approach it. And I think you can make it work. You can make working and home educating work for you, but you have to work out how you're going to do it. Maybe you'll get support from other people. Maybe you've got grandparents who can help you. Maybe you join together with other parents and you know, form your own group. If you've got the means, you might be able to get tutors. Some parents I know have their children doing online school, and their child literally clocks in at 9 o'clock, clocks out at 3, does the day online. Now, that's not for me. That's not the kind of approach that I think would work for my children, but it works for some people, and their child is happy. So everybody's different. Everyone's got different circumstances. Everyone's got different resources, finances. But it's sort of, I think if it's something you really want to do, you can find a way to make it work, and even if it takes you a while to get it right. And obviously your children are always changing, so what works for my kids this year won't necessarily work for them next year. So again, it's keeping us on our toes, really. We have to just keep at it. But and in terms of the social learning side of things, I mean, what my kids do is they have obviously we moved them. So we moved to a new area. They have some cousins who they're close to, who they live nearby, but their cousins are at school. But apart from that, didn't really know anybody. So we were very, very aware when we moved that we wanted them to meet other kids. Obviously, again, the great luxury of home educating is you can meet up with all sorts of people, and if they're not your cup of tea, you don't have to see them again. You know, so that's a real bonus. It's not like, okay, this is the kid you're sitting next to in English and you are stuck with them for the next year. You know, it's so again, there was a lot of me saying, come on, you got to go out and meet people, because they're both quite homebodies. My kids, they like being at home. They're happy with their own company. They fortunately get on really well with each other. So, you know, I was conscious that I wanted them to get out there and meet people as well. But at the same time, not wanting to get massively hung up on the school model of socialization, you know, and just this idea that you just throw 30 kids of the same age into a room together 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, and that socializes your child. I don't really buy that at all. I think there's so many different ways that you can socialize your child. You know, you just get out and about. You go out to places. You meet people, and we do go on trips that are organised by home educating communities, and so they've made friends that way. My son has joined in sort of October time last year. A study group was started up, so there's like 12 of them, aged between 11 and 16, and it's run by a former teacher. She left the system because she wasn't happy with the way children were being treated. she runs this session. They meet up once a week. They do maths, English and science. But obviously, like Val says, it's blurred, you know, all sorts of things come up. She's not restricted by this. And that's brilliant because he's got this small group. They get on really well. They all stay in touch with each other in between. And even though it's only once a week, actually, they're all in touch with each other in between. And so it's, and with my daughter, she has an art class that she goes to. She has a STEM group that she goes to, and other things. I've found personally that there's a lot more for younger children, a lot more kind of organised things. It's harder to find the groups of teenagers. I think there are a lot of teenagers who are out of school who sadly just aren't even in a position to get together with other kids yet because they're just having a really hard time. But perseverance, you know, when we're finding our feet, we're finding what's out there, and the stage we're at now is we've got quite a nicely balanced week, in my opinion, with activities for them to do, friends for them to see. We've got gatherings that are purely social, and then we've got gatherings where they're learning with other children, but in a kind of smaller scenario. And then we've also got time when it's just us and we get to just enjoy being at home. And you know, we bought them a puppy when we moved. We promised we would, and we did. So she's taken up a lot of our time as well. And but she means they get outside because neither of them like sport. And so it's I feel as though we've got most bases covered at the moment. You know, we're sort of doing the best with what we have, really.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing your experiences, Daisy. I wonder if you might pick up on some of the challenges that both Joe and both Joe and Val have covered, and if you're able to comment on perhaps some of the legal and political challenges as well, because I know you're looking. You know, Val was speaking about how we need to reform or revolutionize the way we treat education and assessment. And I would concur with that. I think a lot of the driving forces that we've heard from various people about taking the children out of schools because of dissatisfaction with this status quo in which the education system is right now. To me, it seems like you're looking at both approaches here, looking at different philosophies to both educational reform and alternative forms of education. What scope is there within the kind of political legal realm for transformation? And maybe Val would like to add in afterwards, but just very keen to hear your views on that.
Yeah, so I think what we're starting to see emerging is like Reimagine that I'm launching in September, but there are several kind of school-like settings which are more like a childcare setting in some cases. Sometimes they are more or less like a school, but they're able to operate under 18 hours for a week, which is basically 3 days normal school day type hours. And within that, if they're operating for 18 hours, then they are more or less unregulated. It's slightly different for younger kids, but I won't go into the detail. But what that means is there are places like Hope Sussex, Dragonfly, the Griffin Project, all sorts of things popping up to kind of feed that need in society for there to be, for working families, somewhere for the kids to go when you're actually doing your work. And, you know, it's difficult, you know, it is really difficult to be able to afford to spend time not working to be with your children. Some families are able to make it work, and if you're able to spend your time with your children, there are all sorts of other ways of kind of working like a community. You know, if you've got 5 families, you can say, sweet, that's 5 kids, I'll take them Monday, you take them Tuesday, and you split them across the week, and it costs nobody anything, and it's, you know, it could be wonderful if you find the right tribe. But with a 3-day week, if you're able to find one of these childcare settings, that sometimes they're forest schools, there's all sorts of places. But, you know, if you could theoretically have 2 parents working condensed hours, 5 days across 4, and manage that you each take the kids one day, and then you've got these other 3 days that you'd probably then need to do after school clubs, but like you would with school anyway. So yeah, there is scope for that. There's always that kind of, particularly with the schools bill type legislation, hovering in the background. It seems likely that it might be the kind of thing that does get cracked down on in the future. So I guess these new revolutionary educational settings that are coming up are always having an eye on, you know, are things going to be clamped down on us a bit further? I don't know if Val wants to add anything to that.
I guess I know a lot about schools. Obviously, I've spent most of my career either as a teacher or teaching teachers, but I've also for 18 years been a home education advisor for a local authority. And I have to say, it'd be easy to say school bad, home education good. And I've seen some dreadful examples of home education. You know, actually, what Joe just described with the child that's clocking on at 9, finishing at 3 online, I think is the worst possible model of education. You know, the lone child cannot learn. And it's the relationship they make with another adult, which is so crucial to what we understand about the learning process. If you can feel safe, if you can feel that somebody is there, who you create the relationship with the child through what you're doing with them. And so you don't necessarily have to be an expert, but you do have to make available your more mature emotional framework for them, so they do feel safe to risk. I did my master's as an online course, and I taught postgraduates in various time zones across the world, a master's course in education. It works for adults. I think the unfortunate collateral damage of COVID lockdowns is that parents think therefore it's okay. And it's not. It's just not okay for children, I don't think. I don't have an issue when it's the odd hour or the odd group session on Zoom, but when it's their whole diet, I think I have to be convinced that school is that bad that they have to have that. Then they're not. They can't, you know, the screen time, you know, just in itself bothers me, absolutely bothers me. And I do intervene with those families. I mean, again, if it's a 15-year-old and they're going towards their exams, fine. But, you know, anything younger than that, I mean, 13-year-olds should be flirting with other 13-year-olds, you know, at break times and whatever. They should be forming relationships. They should not be having a relationship with the screen for 6 hours a day. So I don't want to sort of make it that binary, really, you know, school bad. There's a lot that's wrong with school. And I really do want to revolutionize it so parents do have a choice. So when they home educate, it really is electively home educating. I get far too many families who are home educating by default rather than by design. It's because things have gone wrong, because their child has become a loss on the ledger sheet. It's because their child is made to feel that they're not wanted, or their needs aren't being met, or the one size fits all. And I'd much prefer, 18 years ago when I started that role, I used to have the hippies, and I used to have the bohemian types, and I used to have the religious types who consciously said, you know, or the traveller children, you know, they'd go to primary school and then they wanted to have them in the community for the secondary education. That is elective home education. They are making a positive choice. When you've got a broken child with PTSD from whatever has gone on in school, that parent has no choice. And when I have to intervene, I just consider it almost like a car crash. I've got to mop up the mess. We should not be doing that with children. We should not be. And we are hemorrhaging children, you know, who are just too broken to attend school. And so I'm my job, I'm there to design an academic education with the family. But I hardly can go there. I almost have an occupational therapy program for them. You know, I'm there saying things like, they need to have some physical exercise in the outdoors. I need them to be taking the dog for a walk. I need them to be making a cake. I need them to research good mood foods. I need them to be creative. And they go, yeah, but what about their algebra? And I'm going, well, yeah, let's do a little bit of English and maths and let's keep up. So because their self-esteem, you don't want them to fall back. I said, but actually, I've got to rescue the child's emotional well-being, because an anxious, frightened child and a broken, emotionally distraught child isn't going to learn anything. And so I'm very often rebuilding that child before I can put a book in front of them. So that we've got to stop that. This is just, we've got to stop this nonsense, you know, making children casualties of a war zone, which we're calling state education. Stop it. Almost every child I've got on my books is a teenager in that position. I'm going to see 3 on Friday who are all out of school because of anxiety. They can't show up. I'm long in the tooth. I do what I can. I help them. They tell me I help them. They tell me they get better. I then start introducing more formal stuff. And then I'm hoping to, you know, keep those options open. I very rarely return them to school, but I can get them. We're lucky in my authority from 14, I can get them into a part-time college. So my aim is to try and give them a new start. But no one's asking me to design a world-class education, but if they were, I wouldn't be starting with what we've got. I'd be saying, stop this nonsense. Keep your children happy in school. Find out, you know, to think an enforcement officer giving a parent a 500 fine is going to solve things. And I mean, I could, so many case studies, but I'll just give you one that I find so shocking. To this day, I find so shocking. A 12-year-old rape victim. Her attendance from a member of the school, older school population, he wasn't there, but his cousin was. Her attendance went down to 66%, which I think is pretty good for a child that's gone through that. Her parent was issued with a £500 fine for non-attendance. I mean, what are we doing? What are we doing when, as if that's going to solve anything? Well, needless to say, you can tell I'm not afraid to challenge and rattle cages where I need to, and that £500 fine was ripped up, and that school had to supply all the resources that child needed to recover herself. Because I can put doctor in front of my name, and sadly, that's sometimes the only thing that wakes people up, really. You know, and I'm there trying to champion children at child protection meetings saying, well, you know, when they're refusing to do all this, I come out with things, well, I just hope this isn't a career-ending decision for somebody. And then they start going, oh, what do you mean? You have to frighten them and their jobs to get them to do the right thing for kids? Well, again, let's stop that. That wasn't happening when I was a teacher back in the day. No child was being, having to leave school because we weren't caring about them. So anyway, I want to try and resolve what's going on in schools so that we have children who are home educated because, like Joe's family, they're choosing to do so. And I would like home education to remember learning is a collaborative, communal process.
Thank you, Val. David, I want to close with you now to draw together some of the threads of the conversation that we've had so far and center on really the role of education in society today. Val talked about, designing a world-class education system. How can we work together to ensure that all children have access to high quality learning opportunities, whether at home, whether in traditional education settings or within alternative education settings? What's your view on where we go from here?
I mean, this is the big question, isn't it? And I think that's why we're here. And I'm not claiming I have any definitive answers to this in any way. But I think I think why this discussion is so valuable is that starts with looking at what's going wrong and where we're going wrong as far as institutional education goes. And from there we can probably, and like some of us on this call are doing that, we can probably piece together something that's gonna work to nurture better rounded human beings, which is not what the intention of education is at the moment. Like Val was alluding to, we're sort of, it's become more mechanized and it's become more sort of quota driven and all the rest of it. And the effect of that is you've got these kids that Val was talking about, that are kind of suffering from terrible anxiety, that aren't able to actually socialize, that aren't able to go to school, because all of these aspects of a human being are being neglected. That institutional education sees this thing as a very sort of narrow, a narrow way of thinking about this, and I think, I mean, I think we, like I said, we need to look at what's going wrong as far as what's happening now. But I think we also need to think about what is education, fundamentally, what is education, and what should we, is it just about kind of imparting knowledge to children and getting them to repeat it at some point when they sit down and do an exam? Or is it something, or should it be something much more, much broader, much deeper, to nurture these parts of us that are completely neglected? I mean, societally, but as kids in schools and via everything that they're being given, essentially. So I think it's a big question. I think it's a really important question, and I think it's one that the whole COVID thing has really sort of pushed to the fore, and particularly because that a lot of people who saw how we were kind of manipulated and how we were kind of nudged and all the rest of it throughout this, are thinking, okay, this sort of immediate danger is kind of easing off, but it's still very much there. And how are we going to create a more resilient generation when this thing comes up again? Because it will come up again. We can see in the World Health Organization, their pandemic preparedness thing, it's that something like this will happen again, and we need to make sure that our kids and our adults indeed as well aren't as susceptible as they were to it. And how we do that is probably at least largely the responsibility of education, and how we're going to educate them. And I think it comes down to this thing that I touched on earlier, in regards to kind of authority and their relationship to authority, and how that is how that's instilled to them in school, and their relationship to themselves as well, and their ability to be an individual, but and their ability to stand by themselves, their ability to not be swayed by peer pressure. I mean, they're always going to be swayed by peer pressure to an extent when they're that age, but essentially to be more resilient human beings, to whatever is coming next.
Thank you, David. I'd like to just give Daisy the opportunity to wrap up with an elevator pitch, if you will, for your vision for reimagine.org.uk. I know you've been working on a big project here. If you could just very succinctly capture what you're attempting to achieve with Reimagine.
Yeah, I won't do too much of a pitch because we're already oversubscribed before launch, but I think there's a lot to be said for what can be made around parents who are in a working family, whether you're able to find a community group who will share the care between you, whether you can find something like Reimagine, which is like a curiosity nurturing environment, or whether you can just do things to kind of help counteract some of the more toxic elements in schools. Like, if your child's in school, but you make it clear to your child, it's not important to me how you do in your exams. I want to help you find your interests. You can still spend your evenings, their after school clubs, exploring their what they really want to do. But you can you can't completely eradicate them being in a school environment where there is all this, learn what you need to know on the test, regurgitate what you need for the test, get good results on the test. That pressure will always be there. But if you can at least ameliorate that stress by saying, yeah, actually, It's not, it's more important that you find something you're interested in, learn something useful. Like you aren't necessarily going to need all these exams. And if you come across an exam you really need, then we can always revisit if you don't get the results you need. But I think parents, you don't have to, I mean, it's great if you're able to take a really alternative route, but there are also ways where you can, as a working parent with your kids in school, do things that can help. Just support your child's well-being. That's the main thing. If they've got time to really let their hair down, space to relax at weekends, like getting them out in nature, all that kind of stuff. Like my kids, I saw when I picked them up from preschool at 3, they used to be they have meltdowns. Just getting out in the woods and having a walk after school every day could have a huge impact on a child's well-being and how they're able to cope with the school environment as well. So there's a message of hope. There's lots that can be done, even for kids in school, I would say.
Thank you, Daisy. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, our contributors today for this Elevating Education discussion, exploring new approaches to learning in the post-COVID era. We've had Dr. Val Fraser, we've had Joe, David, and Daisy with us this evening. We're now going to open up to audience questions. I want to thank everyone for taking part in today's session. Thanks for listening, and please do share this conversation. And thanks once again to all of our panelists.